I thought I'd begin with some appropriate music, and there's nothing quite so appropriate to horror as Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D. This has probably been corrupted in more horror movies than any other piece of music. I'm just adjusting my volume here. Apparently I'm okay. I hope everybody can hear me. And indeed hear the music. I see you all out there, Joanne and Anne and Stephanie and Marianne. Indeed, Marianne, it is glorious weather, isn't it? It's just shouldn't be like this at this time of the year, but thank goodness it is. Hello, Joan and Gail. As I say, Bach's Toccata and Fugue is probably renowned as the great piece of horror music. I'm not quite sure why, except it's very portentous. And it has a sort of a dash of evil about it. Hello, David. Welcome back. And Yoche, welcome back. Forbidden love makes all of us curious, not only in the Netherlands, but also even in America, although it's usually less permitted in America. Hi, Dennis and John Henry. A lot of our regulars are back. Bless you all. James and Karen. All eager for a little horror, which is the main point of these two programs, these two webinars that I'm going to do, is why we are so fascinated by it, why we're so interested in it. So I hope to give you a little explanation of that, or at least, if not explanation, my opinion. Hi, John in Toronto. Welcome back. And John, yes, I intend to agree with you, although I'm getting far too old to care. But any kind of love, forbidden or otherwise. Well, the forbidden love can sometimes be illegal as well, so we have to be careful of that. Hello, Jim in Greensburg. And boo to you, Helen. It's nice to see all the regulars coming back. It makes me feel we always talk about the PICT family, that these webinars have extended the family in a very sort of positive way. Just always remember, you can invite your friends as well, because it's free. All they have to do is register. And the more people in the family, the happier we are. It's one of those rare occasions when having a huge family doesn't actually cost anything. Hello, Mark in Rochester. Hi, David. And also, if you do interest your friends and you do entice them to register for the webinar, remember, you're not trapped at 2:00 on a Friday. They can always catch up on the webinars as you can online at our website. You just go to the PictTheatre.org website, you go to PICT Educates, and there you'll find all the webinars all the way back. They're all there. And I do know that quite a few of our friends around the world log into that rather than being up at 2 a.m. in whatever time zone they're in. So you can catch up on any of these webinars. They're always available. And if you have friends around the world who might be interested in tuning in for these, let them know. Just forward the forward the email that you get and say, tune into this. It's interesting. Oh, well, I hope it's interesting. Who else have we got? It's flying there on my chat list. Martha, hello. Hi. Hello to the Buckleys. And hello, Grace. Cold night in Dublin. It's very often a cold night in Dublin. But at this time of the year, it's supposed to be. We're not getting the cold at the moment here in Pittsburgh. It's ridiculously warm. I think it was yesterday, because we do Fahrenheit here, it was 79 degrees at one point, which is, when you consider that we're over halfway through October, ridiculously warm. Glorious. I hope you're well, Grace. I think we can all agree that wherever we are in the world, the weather is not what we were used to in times gone by, and the climate is unquestionably changing. David, you're quite right. That movie, Don't Look Now, is one of the scariest movies ever made, and I mention it in the programs, but for the very reason that most things scare us. And yeah, I will actually come to that point. Dennis and Anne, yes, Poe was a master of it. I like to think that he was more a master of terror than horror, and there is a tiny difference, which I may be dwelling on next week's webinar. But we did a few years back. We did two of Poe's stories. We did the Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher, and I described them as two tales of terror rather than of horror. But as I say, I'll discuss that next week. Yeah, definitely, Sarah. Not a dark and stormy night in Scott Township. Yep, and you're quite right. Irving's Headless Horseman falls into exactly the same category as most of the other things I'm going to be talking about. It's a very clever story, and preys upon our primal fears, which is really what it's all about. For those of you joining us late, I've been playing Bach, and particularly the Toccata and Fugue, which is you might say, the mother of all horror movie themes, for reasons that Bach would never understand. And a happy pre-Halloween to everybody. Jean, another one of our Rochester guests. Alicia, you're right. The Historian is a remarkably clever piece of Gothic storytelling, and I recommend it to anybody. Elizabeth Kostova, a really very clever book. Well worth reading. So, before Bach continues, I'm going to stop him, and hopefully, yeah, there we go. And I suppose it's time to begin. Now, I did a stupid thing earlier, by the way. I started printing up my notes, and halfway through printing them, I ran out of ink. So I'm going to have to take my notes off of a tablet. So if you see me constantly looking down, it's because I'm looking at the tablet. I am a very silly person when it comes to things like keeping up with the printing ink in my printer. Before we begin, a couple of other announcements. First of all, we're very grateful that these two webinars on the topic of Gothic horror have been sponsored in memory of Cora Dixon. We are deeply grateful for that. As we say, the sponsoring of these webinars makes it easier for us to produce. We do not charge for them. They are always free. We do look for donations, and if anybody is interested in sponsoring, send us an email. We'll send you all the details. One other thing that I want to remind you of, speaking of Gothic horror, if you want an experience of it, you can, of course, go to our website and click on the link to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, which we have recorded as a radio drama. It's absolutely wonderful. It's got a lot of wonderful PICT actors in the cast. It's about 2 hours of listening, but we're really, really delighted with it. We have to make a charge for that. It's I think it's something like $13.95. We get $10 of that. The platform gets the other $3.95 for providing the service. But for $13.95, you're going to get a fully dramatized, beautifully performed rendition of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll. So please, please, please consider doing that. In times of COVID, we cannot put plays on the stage. This is the only way that we can, A, employ our actors, and B, give you an entertainment. So I would ask you, spread the word. If you haven't heard it already, tune into it, but let your friends know it's there and available as well. And all the details are available on site, and I think something's just come up on the chat concerning how you can connect to that. It's available for one more week after this. It finishes on Halloween. So that's the request and the commercial. So let us discuss the question of Gothic horror. Now, I put under the title on the website the wonderful old prayer of ghosties, from ghosties and ghoulies and long-legged beasties, dear Lord, deliver us. And it is a demonstration that this fear of the unknown, of the dark, of the weird and wonderful, goes back a huge period of time. I strongly suspect that the cavemen in their caves, while painting on their art on the wall, were also telling one another ghost stories, that they were afraid of the dark. The most important thing that they had was fire to keep the dark at bay. There is a primal fear within all of us. And upon that fear, we love to delight. And that's the point I want to make. So this week, I'm going to examine two particular themes. And they're based on the principle of blood, eternal youth, and forbidden love. And you're going to meet briefly with three heroes, well, two heroes and a heroine, from the three particular novels concerning blood, youth, and love. Next week, we're going to look at a different aspect. We're going to look at what we might describe as the most familiar term, the dark side. And we're going to look at some of the writers who bring them there and what it is about the dark side that fascinates us. So let me ask this simple question to begin with. Why do we delight in fear? And we do. And it starts with tales of terror that we actually learn from childhood. Some of the earliest stories that we hear as children are tales of terror, for instance. And those same themes carry through into our adult entertainment, if you like. I'll give you an example. One of the great, primal fairy stories, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I mean, what a lovely, harmless tale for small children. Goldilocks, the classic blonde, venturing where she should not go. Always in horror movies, the one thing we want to scream at the screen is, don't go upstairs. But always the heroine will tend, or sometimes the hero, but it tends to be the heroine, will always go upstairs. Will always go into the dark cellar. Will always go to the place where we know danger lurks. Goldilocks goes into the bear's house. And when there is always a temptation. For Goldilocks, it's 3 bowls of porridge. For the heroines or heroes of stories, it could be the clue they're seeking, or the treasure that they want, or the information that they must find. Always there is the temptation there. For Goldilocks, it's the bowls of porridge. But then that is followed always by the arriving threat. The three bears come home. She has to hide. She's gone into the place of danger. She's found a place to secrete herself, up in the attic, down in the basement, in a closet, wherever. But the arriving threat has arrived. If one casts one's mind back to a certain famous Halloween movie, he's in the house. That threat is a classic follow-through from our primal children's fairy tales. And she succeeds in escaping with her life. That's also an important factor, because when we enjoy horror, when we bring horror into our imaginations to revel in it for a while, it is terribly important that we escape. If we don't escape, we're in real trouble. I'll give you another example. Another wonderful fairy tale about a brother and sister who are trotting through the woods and see the ultimate temptation. The temptation of a gingerbread house. And Hansel and Gretel cannot resist the temptation. And that temptation can lead to their doom. It can result in their death. This is a fairy tale for children. We might describe it as a moral tale, which is resist temptation, because if you, and I'll come to that point later, if you don't resist temptation, you are risking your life. That by temptation, by following that temptation, we can bring about our own destruction. Being a moral tale, they have to survive. And they survive in the most gruesome way imaginable. They push the witch into the oven and cook her. This is a wonderful moral tale for children, but in fact what it is, it's not. What it is a moral tale for adults. But it gives us, again, that relief factor that no matter how bad the danger is, there is always a way out, there's always an escape. We can survive this. And that's another important factor in Gothic horror, or as I prefer to call it, Gothic romance. And if you think I'm exaggerating, read the original Tales of the Brothers Grimm. They are gruesome. They are horrific. Why do they frighten us? Well, is it excitement rather than fear? I still like to think that any tale of horror, any tale of terror, actually excites us. It gets the heart beating and the blood moving. Blood moves in very strange ways in some horror tales. But it's not fear. It is an excitement of the senses. Or maybe that's what fear is. Do we still, in fact, fear our actual childhood dreads? And are they represented by these stories? I mean, the thing under the bed that is always there, the monkey in the closet, whatever it is that our childhood fear was, becomes translated again into these tales, that the writers of these have simply played upon those aspects of our imagination, the things that we find dreadful, in the pure sense of the word, being full of dread or giving us a sense of dread. I said that the Gothic horror story was best regarded as a romantic, Gothic romances or romantic fiction. And again, I'm using the word in its very pure sense, a romance, a fancy of the mind. The very first one was actually written by the English author Horace Walpole. It was called The Castle of Otranto in 1764, quite a while back. Horace Walpole was the youngest son of the very first British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. Robert Walpole had one wonderfully famous quote, which I think might have influenced his son, that one should try everything once except incest and country dancing. But that's totally beside the point. I'm quoting here, Gothic fiction tends to place emphasis on both emotion and a pleasurable kind of terror. The most common of these pleasures amongst Gothic readers was the sublime which was an indescribable feeling that takes us beyond ourselves. In other words, to create a mystery and a sense of dread, in that purer sense that I meant, that brings us out of the mundanity of our own lives and brings us into a fantasy world. That's true of much of literature. It's true of what Ian Fleming did when he created James Bond. It brings us into another world where we can, for a time, take risks, feel dread, feel fear, and know that by the end of it, we will be safe again. True horror, there is no redemption. True horror, when you're dead, you're dead. True horror, when you're tortured, you're tortured. But this is romantic fiction. This is taking our imaginations and putting us into a place where we can feel the fear, feel the dread, but by the end of it, we can feel safe again. Now, by the end of the 1700s, you had writers like Anne Radcliffe fully developing this genre. Mary Shelley in the 19th century with Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe, even Charles Dickens was dealing with Gothic themes, this sense of taking us to a world of dread and danger. And Christmas Carol is technically, on that level, a Gothic romance. Oliver Twist is a Gothic romance, taking us into places of danger and dread. The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which was his unfinished. By the 1800s, late 1800s, we had probably the most famous Gothic horror story of them all, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which sort of dominated the whole field of Gothic horror. By the way, the word Gothic actually comes from the Goths and eventually came to mean German. So Gothic architecture, Gothic literature, Gothic, that whole Gothic movement throughout Europe comes from a Germanic source. Just talking about the history of it slightly, there was a very, what we would now call a penny dreadful in the year. It was nobody knows who wrote it. It was anonymous, and it was around 1847, and it had the unlikely name of Varney the Vampire. The Varney of the tale was actually Sir Francis Varney, and I'm not going to go into the story, but the important point about it is that it sort of defined the vampire. The vampire myth was all across Central Europe for centuries, but this brought it into literature in a very clear and precise way. And many of the ideas that modern audiences have with vampires come from this particular story. For instance, it was the very first vampire story to create the myth of the pointy teeth. That started with Varney the Vampire in 1847. So from the 1880s on, there was a change in this whole mode of writing. And we started to get introduced into it, the more modern contemporary fears that were beginning to emerge, because we're talking about a world that was coming to terms with Darwin. We were talking about a world that was coming to terms with modern science, the social structures of the time, looking at free thinking as well, which was also beginning to erupt in that period. So then you got writers like Robert Louis Stevenson with his strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which of course you can hear if you tune in to the website. You had Oscar Wilde, Picture of Dorian Gray, which was 1891. George du Maurier's Trilby, Henry James' Turn of the Screw, 1898. These were examining horror and the Gothic romance in a slightly new way. They were infinitely more psychological rather than assumed physical. And Dorian Gray, which I will be talking about in a little while, Dorian Gray was a remarkable piece of degenerate writing, in that it advocated a form of degeneracy as a lifestyle and the price you pay for it. Henry James' Turn of the Screw, as we all know, is a psychological drama. By the way, the Irish were very good at this particular genre. They tended to be Protestants, the old Anglo-Irish ascendancy, but you had writers like Charles Maturin, and his book, Melmoth the Wanderer, if you've never read it, give it a read. It is classic Gothic horror. Sheridan Le Fanu, Bram Stoker, obviously. They tended to write stories that involved, again, images that have become classic Gothic as Bach's Toccata and Fugue. Castles in barren landscapes, remote aristocratic families. It was, I suppose the Irish wrote it in a sense that it was demonstrative of the collapse of the old order of Ireland that resulted by the turn of the 20th century in revolution. Le Fanu used a wonderfully gloomy villain and persecuted heroine, the classic case of don't go upstairs, don't go into the basement, in his story Uncle Silas, which is a story of horror and of fear without actually anything gruesome ever happening. He also wrote a short story in a collection called In a Glass Darkly, and it includes what has been described as the superlative vampire tale. That's called Carmilla. And it deeply, he wrote that 1872, I'm just checking my notes here, 1872, had a deep influence on another Dublin writer called Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula in 1897. But Carmilla preceded Dracula, and as I will demonstrate in a few minutes, is a very distinct contrast in the nature of how horror works in these. There was a lady writer, Regina Maria Roche, and she wrote a novel called Claremont about somebody trapped in a castle with people who were deeply dangerous to her, and that was actually parodied by Jane Austen in her Gothic parody Northanger Abbey. Both of those stories well worth reading, particularly Northanger Abbey because it's Jane Austen and she just writes beautifully. So, to get back to the original point, that which we cannot explain or comprehend becomes our irrational fear. And all horror, all terror, all of that Gothic movement is based on that. If we cannot explain it, if we cannot comprehend it, it becomes our irrational fear. Ghosties and ghoulies and long-legged beasties. The extension of that is, and things that go bump in the night. If we do not know what they are, we've all done it. We've all woken at some time and heard strange noises in the house and wondered what they might be. And if our imagination is rife, or if we have tasted a little too much Irish whiskey before going to bed, very often our irrational fears become real. The irrational fear of the unknown. The whole witch cult and the whole witch burning and witch drowning cult throughout Europe, and indeed early North America, is based on irrational fear. People who could do things that we couldn't explain. Why did that woman have a cat that responded to her? Why did she have a third nipple? Why could she cure things with herbs and potions and brews? We can't understand it, therefore it must be of the devil. It is that irrational fear of that which we cannot explain. Even hell, as we understand it, is Gothic horror. Our notion of hell was defined most brilliantly in a wonderful Gothic horror story written long before the Gothic period by Dante, the Divine Comedy. All of our images of hell, all of the things that we understand and talk about are pretty much laid out by Dante in his Divine Comedy. It's a horror story. And to bring it up to date in terms of writers, there's one writer who has actually, probably more than anyone, grasped that notion that what we fear is that which we cannot always understand. It can be rain, relentless rain. It can be a mist that drifts in and seems to devour everything in its in its presence. It can simply be the dark in which we cannot see the reality of what something is. Stephen King, more than any other modern writer, has achieved this. His horror, his tales of horror, are based almost entirely on that which we cannot rationally explain at the time. So I want to look at three particular books, three particular stories. And I'm just having a quick check on the, yes, people are, yes, providing information. Thank you very much for doing that on the chat line. And the three novels I want to look at are concerned with love, blood, and the desire for youth. But they're also concerned with something else, eternity. That which is eternal, that which we often desire to be eternal. One of the things when we fall in love, and some of us have done it far too often, when we fall in love, the one thing that we frequently say is, I will love you forever. We use the word representing eternity, forever. We know in our heart and soul this is not possible. Even the church only admits marriage till death us do part, although I believe the Mormons consider that to be eternal as well. I'm not being specific about this because my knowledge of religion is very limited. But the notion that I will love you forever is rubbish. Unless you are a vampire. Because one of the things that the vampire represents is a form of eternity, eternal existence. The first story I want to talk about is the story of Carmilla, Le Fanu's remarkable short novel, well worth a read. And with luck, by some point next year, you'll be hearing it as a radio drama presented by PICT Classic Theatre. But Carmilla is a different kind of vampire to what one expects, because most of our expectation of vampires is now based around Bram Stoker's book, and I'll come to that in a minute. Carmilla is a different kind of vampire, and she is a direct first cousin to all our fears and pleasures. That is a big statement. I'm going to read what I wrote because it's clearer that way. This is all about the sharing of life through the gift of blood. The giving and the taking of life through the gift of blood, through the giving and taking of blood. The warm flow of life leaving and of eternal life coming, sort of life in transit. And by making this blood sacrifice, you are buying more future. And this is an act of love in this particular story. Now, why do we have that fear of it's a genetic fear. The dark ancestral memories that go back to things like the Black Death that wiped out 2/3 of Europe. Plague is always a source of fear, as we're beginning to discover right at this moment. In this context, the vampire as the loser in the game of life and death. The vampire is the loser in the game of life and the loser in the game of death. The victim as well as the villain, both the corrupter and the corrupted. In that sense, vampirism in these stories is a kind of bacterial or viral contagion passed by love. Love, like vampirism, is a transmission of life and death. Now, this is not, I'm not being smart here, but it's a fundamental fact of life as we understand it. And we want to understand the fundamental facts in terms of Gothic horror or Gothic romance as something that we can risk and dread, but survive. Come out at the other end happier, wiser, and have a cup of hot chocolate and go to bed. Now, in terms of a vampire, The nature of life and the nature of death are absent in both. Death is more than a stillness or a silence. It is an absence in the vampire. And in the vampire, the memory may still be present, the ideas, even the action, but life is absence, and so is death. Vampirism is not only the destruction of life, but the destruction of death as well. When a vampire exists, it has no life, and it cannot die. It is empty. Carmilla as a novel is fascinating because it gives the vampire an emotion that we normally do not expect. Carmilla, being a vampire, must take life to survive, not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of necessity. Like all of us, she must eat. She must take sustenance. But when she kills, with regard to the heroine of the story, the other heroine, the girl Laura, she tries, or she offers to kill as an act of love, of passion. And in exchange for the blood of life, she is offering an ecstasy in death. This is a wonderful concept because it's examining the notion of that which we fear, that which we dread, that which was dreaded all over medieval Europe, that which caused graves to be desecrated and stakes to be driven through hearts and heads to be chopped off. That dread is now given a whole new concept, that the vampire is merely a victim as much as a protagonist, as much as something to be pitied as much as something to be feared, because that is there in our subconscious too. Somewhere deep down, we have this sense of the victim. Beauty and the Beast. The Beast is a hero. The Beast is feared, the Beast is dreaded, but by an act of love, the Beast can become human again. And in Carmilla, in Le Fanu's story, there is that possibility. It doesn't work out. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work out. But that, to my mind, is what makes this particular story fascinating and what makes it, in many senses, more terrible, more horrible. Again, using the words in their pure sense. The horror, the terror that somebody could be cursed to eternal existence without life, without death, but with one abiding and overwhelming remembrance of what it was to be alive, and that is love. Carmilla's love for Laura, and it is unquestionably the love between two women, or at least one woman for another, it's so great so that she has to keep her alive. She doesn't kill. She tries to convert. She tries to convert Laura to that love that she feels. First by teaching her the liturgy of love, and eventually the liturgy of death, and finally the act of living death, but she cannot carry it out. Let me talk about that for a moment in Le Fanu's own words. How Laura describes Carmilla. She was slender, wonderfully graceful, except that her movements were languid, very languid indeed. Her complexion was rich and brilliant, her features were small and beautifully formed, her eyes large and lustrous. Her hair was quite wonderful. I never saw hair so magnificently thick and long when it was down about her shoulders. I have often placed my hands under it and laughed with wonder at its weight. It was exquisitely fine and soft, and in a color, a rich, very dark brown with something of gold. I loved to let it down, tumbling with its weight, as in her room she lay back in her chair, talking in her sweet, low voice. I used to fold it, braid it, spread it out, and played with it. Heavens, if I had but known. Here we see a writer creating an image of Carmilla, who is the vampire, who is the undead, who is, if you care to put it that way, the villain of the piece, but treating her as an object of desire. Remember what I said about Hansel and Gretel walking into the house of temptation. And Carmilla presents herself as a temptation that Laura, the girl, falls for. The promise of the vampire is given in this as well. And again, this is a promise we all are attracted to. That's why we read Gothic horror. She used to place her pretty arms about my neck and draw me to her, laying her cheek to mine, murmur with her lips near my ear, "Dearest, your little heart is wounded. Think me not cruel because I obey the irresistible law of my strength and weakness. If your dear heart is wounded, my wild heart bleeds with yours. In the rapture of my enormous humiliation, I live in your warm life, and you shall die, sweetly die, into mine. I cannot help it. As I draw near to you, you in your turn will draw to others and learn the rapture of that cruelty, which yet is love. So for a while, seek to know no more of me and mine, but trust in me with your loving spirit." This is divine temptation. This is the vampire saying to someone who she loves, "We will be together. I will destroy you, but only to have you forever. I will love you forever, eternally." The only way that that act can be carried out is by the vampiric act, the taking of blood, the blood sacrifice. It is something that from the earliest days of Christianity, everybody understood. The ultimate blood sacrifice, which is represented in the Mass. These are fears and pleasures that we can delight in, provided we know we are safe, that at the end all will be well. He goes on with this story and describes how Laura, asleep at night, would have these terrible dreams of a cat-like creature crawling through her rooms and suddenly turning into a tall, dark, feminine figure looking at her from the end of her bed and then walking away. It's the image of the vampire who loves so much that she has to fight to bring herself to the point when she can take the blood of the girl and convert her into a vampire to be with her forever. At the end, we find out, unfortunately, that not all is not good, and that Carmilla has to leave and is found and is destroyed in the inimitable fashion by which all vampires meet their ends. Now, I want you to contrast that image of love, that image of wanting to be bonded forever, with what Bram Stoker deals with, and how he describes. I read to you there how Laura describes Carmilla, the vampire. Listen here to how Bram Stoker, through the words of Jonathan Harker, describes Dracula. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been renewed, for the white hair and moustaches were changed to dark iron grey. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corner of the mouth, ran over the chin and neck. Even the deep burning eyes seemed set among the swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. This was the being I was helping to transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come, he might amongst its teeming millions satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helpless. Compare that with what Carmilla says. I cannot help it as I draw near to you. You in your turn will draw near to others and learn the rapture of that cruelty, which yet is love. So where we have Bram Stoker describing this hideous, awful, disgusting creature who satiates his lust for blood, contrasted with this beautiful and almost guiltless creature condemned to eternal emptiness, who can feel only one emotion, love, and that love will destroy her, and by definition, save us. Bram Stoker also does something else for us. He gives a definition of what the vampire is. Van Helsing, before we do anything, let me tell you this. It is out of the law and the experience of the ancients and of all those who have studied the powers of the undead. When they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. Note that. It is the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. The implication being that the price you pay for immortality is that you are essentially evil. Very seldom do you find the notion, maybe in what was the Far Pavilions, or whatever it was, the notion of Shangri-La, that eternal life is possible, and goodness. But mostly within Gothic horror, immortality means evil. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind, and so the circle goes on ever widening, like the ripples from a stone thrown in the water. Now, I mentioned before, this notion of an evil that spreads itself like a disease, and so much of this came from the Middle Ages, from the Black Death, from the various plagues that swept Europe. This notion of the undead, that people who in their coffins did not decompose. And that's not completely unusual. It sometimes happens. And in fact, there are various saints who are supposed to be uncorrupted in death. In fact, if you go to the cathedral in Seville, you can see at least, I know there's one body there because I saw it, who is still not decomposed. It can happen. Usually something to do with the soil they're buried in, or the acidity or lack of it. But this notion of the undead is simply the notion of the uncorrupted, the undecomposed. But that notion stuck in the mind of people, and that became the irrational fear, the fear that we delight in, provided at the end of the story we survive. But I love that notion. All that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind, and so the circle goes ever widening, like the ripples from a stone thrown in water. And that is our fear. That is the fear we delight in, that it just gets worse and worse and worse. And if you want to know what that feels like, go outside right now without a mask. It is simply using nature and what nature offers to tantalize our inner fears. Then he comes to something really important, which I think is important. Excuse me. When you're examining this concept of the undead, the killing of the vampire. The vampire kills with a kiss. Yes, takes blood. In Stoker's version of it, it's not a particularly beautiful thing. In Le Fanu's version of it with Carmilla, it is an act of love. It is the taking of a life, but with a kiss. How do we kill a vampire? Take this stake in your left hand, ready to place the point over the heart, and the hammer in your right. And when we begin our prayer for the dead, I shall read him, I have here the book, and others shall follow. Strike in God's name, so that all may be well with the dead that we love, and the undead pass away. I'm quoting from the book. Arthur took the stake and hammer, and when once his mind was set on action, he never trembled nor even quivered. Van Helsing opened the missal and began to read, and Quincy and I followed as well we could. Arthur placed the point over the heart, and as I looked, I could see the dint in the white flesh. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, while the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and his high duty seemed to shine through it. The sight of it gave us courage, so that our voices seemed to ring through the little vault. And then the writhing and quivering of the body became less. The teeth seemed to champ and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still, and the terrible task was over. That is so unspeakably gruesome. The vampire kills with a kiss. We kill the vampire with an act of sublime torture. And why that matters and why that is interesting is because we are pleased that it happens. That our dread, our fear is not merely destroyed, because that's what happens to Carmilla at the end of Le Fanu's story as well. We are delighted that the resolution is so complete, it gives us satisfaction. Now, it is the same, I think, and of course everything I tell you may be wrong, I always have to say that, but I think it is the same fascination we experience when we see a car crash. It's the same fascination we see when we see an accident. We don't all rush to help, but most of us stand and watch. There is a fascination in something horrible happening. What is it feeding in our imaginations? It is feeding the fact that we can thrill at fear and be grateful it isn't us. That's what excites us. That's why we delight in these stories, and delight in them we do. We see, in this sense, that the killing by the vampire with an act of love or simply a need to survive is followed by the killing of the vampire by an act of extreme cruelty. It's as if we redeem our guilty pleasure by a savage revenge on that which corrupted us. Because within our own concept of what is evil, what is good, what is horrible in its pure sense, or what is terrible in its pure sense, we have taken a vicarious pleasure in the reading of it. We've taken a delight in the watching of it. And we must redeem ourselves. And we redeem ourselves generally by an act of revenge. And it can be argued, and I'd be delighted to hear your opinions on it, that all the actions that we do to revenge crime, cruelty, that which we do not understand, are in fact a way of redeeming ourselves, of saying, well, it was a horrible thing, but I approved of what was done to the person because it was just. Was it? You enjoyed it. Hopefully, if you like Gothic horror. So we've looked there at the price, and I'm just checking the time, yes. We've looked at the price of eternal life and the lust for eternal life and the price you pay for eternal life. Now we're going to look at the lust for eternal youth, because that is the other thing that we all long for. And if you don't believe me, check up on the price of Botox. We all want to stay young. God knows I do. And what is the price we're willing to pay for eternal youth? Oscar Wilde was a writer of sublime satires, but also a poet, and also wrote some wonderful pieces for the newspaper, some wonderful dialogues, some wonderful. He was, to all intents and purposes, a philosopher as much as a writer. And he wrote a book that was highly condemned at the time, and described as evil, but it was an interesting, indeed a fascinating examination of the price we will pay for youth. Youth is something we all regret. Youth is something we all miss. Youth is something we all wish could last forever. We look out of our windows now and see the beauty of the fall, but we all wish it was the beauty of the spring. Now, the other point that Oscar was dealing with was the tempter and the tempted. And let's go back to those childhood fairy tales again. The temptation of going into the place of danger. The tempter who brings you into the place of danger. With Goldilocks, she just went somewhere she shouldn't go. With Hansel and Gretel, they were tempted in a gingerbread house with an old woman who said, I will give you the things that you desire. I will give you the gingerbread. I'll give you all the lovely cakes. I'll give you all of that. The tempter is another primal constituent of that which builds for horror and terror. The tempter is the serpent in Eden, the one who offers the forbidden fruit as a way to get the thing you want most. Why did the serpent offer Eve the forbidden fruit? So that they would be on a par with God, that they would have from the tree of life their own independence from something that could destroy them, time. In Dorian Gray, Oscar creates one of his most remarkable creations, Lord Henry Wotton, the ultimate tempter. And in the very first chapter of the book, he sets up this brilliant offer. I'm going to read it to you, because the words of Oscar are better than anything I could transpose. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Oh my God, what a lie. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. That is wicked. You, Mr. Gray, you yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, you have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose memory might stain your cheek with shame. Oscar understood. We all have them. Every one of us is tempted by that which is forbidden, the forbidden fruit. You are a wonderful creation, Mr. Gray. You have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having. You don't feel it now, but someday you will feel it terribly. You have a beautiful face, Mr. Gray. The gods have been good to you, but what the gods give, they take away. And when youth goes, beauty will go with it. There is such a little time, Mr. Gray, such a little time. The hill flowers wither, yet they blossom again. While we degenerate, haunted by the memory of temptations we had not the courage to yield to. How tragic it would be if you were wasted. For there is such a little time that your youth will last, such a little time. The common hill flowers wither, but they blossom again, but we never get back our youth. The pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish, our limbs fail, our senses rot. We degenerate into hideous puppets, haunted by the memory of passions which we were too much afraid, and the exquisite temptations that we had not the courage to yield to. Youth, youth. There is absolutely nothing in the world but youth. And that is the ultimate temptation. And the genius of Oscar in writing it in this way is that it is something we all have felt. How many times will we celebrate a particular birthday by saying, oh, I've just reached the big 4-0. Oh, I'm 30 now. Oh, I'm 25. I'm a quarter of a century old. You know, it doesn't matter what age it is, you always have that sense of regret. And why didn't I do that while I was young? Why didn't I do that when I was younger? Can I still do it now I'm my age? All of these things, they rest within us, these memories, these dreads, these fears, and they excite us. They give us pleasure. These thoughts pleasure us, and we feel guilty because they're not proper, they're not right. They defy convention, they defy moral law or whatever. we delight in them. They are our guilty pleasures, our guilty thoughts. And Oscar was quite brilliant in this, because this is the horror that we all live with. The horror we all live with is that we're going to die. And some of us a lot sooner than others. We live with it every day of our lives. And then things occur, such as the current situation, where death is not just an abstract, but it is a distinct possibility that if we don't obey certain rules, follow certain patterns of behavior, nationally, personally, locally, if we don't live that life, we could die. Death is an ever-present factor in all things of horror. The advantage of the romantic horror, the Gothic romance, is that there is always a way out. There is always a solution. In life, there isn't. But in this kind of horror that attracts us, that we want to read, this is part of that factor. But the ultimate tempter must create the ultimate temptation. And the ultimate temptation that Lord Henry has offered to Dorian Gray is eternal youth. If only that were possible. Basil has painted a picture of Dorian Gray. And this picture perfectly encapsulates him. It is a magnificent work of art in that it is an absolute representation in the pre-Raphaelite sense. Nothing added, nothing taken away, but a perfect representation in art of the beauty of Dorian. And the beauty of Dorian, apart from its obvious homoerotic implications, the beauty of Dorian is that sense that a person in his purest sense, while innocent, is beautiful. So it is not simply the beauty of the body, as Lord Henry describes, but the beauty of the soul. Dorian looks at the painting, and the ultimate temptation is before him. How sad it is, murmured Dorian Gray, with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. How sad it is. I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful. He's just heard Lord Henry's description of what growing old actually means. But this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If only it were the other way. If it were I who could be always young, and the picture that was to grow old. For that I would give everything. Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. And there is your key, because that is the one thing that we all have. I mean, we all have that temptation. There are so many times in our own lives when that particular temptation, maybe not quite so extreme, but that particular, what I wouldn't give for, how many times have you said it? I would give for, how many times have you said it? It's something that we recognize always within ourselves. Fear, terror, temptation. The temptation will always lead, always, to fear. Because if you suddenly get what you want, your immediate response is, oh my God, what have I done? How did I deserve this? If something horrible happens to you, what have I done? How did I deserve this? That doubt comes within all of us. That fear comes within all of us. When we get what we want, we are suddenly not so sure we want it, because there is always a price to pay. And as I say, the genius of Gothic horror, the genius of these Gothic romances, always, is that it presents us with the opportunity to experience the pleasure, to experience the fear, and yet, in some strange way, to redeem ourselves, either through the destruction of that which tempted us, or simply the escape from that which tempted us. The destruction of the vampire with the stake through the heart is no different than the pushing of the witch into the oven by Hansel and Gretel. It is exactly that same ritual of, I will destroy that which has tempted me. I will destroy that which has led me astray. And in fiction, and that's why I say it is romantic as much as it is horrific, It is a romance in which all things come right in the end, which isn't always true of life. So that fundamentally is what I want to say about those particular novels. There's an awful lot of comments coming up, and I'm going to read through them once we finish this. But I want to, I had something slipped to me here. What's the difference between supernatural fiction and Gothic horror? It's a very slim line. Ghost stories and scary tales of life in India, for instance. Kendra asked me that question. The difference between horror and supernatural is that horror does not necessarily involve the supernatural. Horror can involve the real life, the real world. If you look at stories like Northanger Abbey, if you look at stories like Uncle Silas, if you look at an awful lot of what Stephen King writes, horror is what we perceive, but does not necessarily involve that which is, in other words, it can be natural. Our fears are based on things that can be real. Yes, the notion of the vampire is supernatural, but the notion of Uncle Silas isn't. Supernatural as a different genre doesn't necessarily involve horror. It can involve fantasy. It can involve a lot of other things. So I think there is a distinction, but I think it does get blurred in certain areas. So the stories of vampires and werewolves are a combination of horror and supernatural, whereas you can have absolute horror that is not supernatural. It's just based on irrational fear of that which actually exists. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's the best I can come with at the moment. Somebody making the point, fun fact, when Carmilla was first published as a serial, it was accompanied by illustrations by David Henry Friston, who also illustrated the original Sherlock Holmes stories. Everything is linked and everything is connected. Immortality, yes, immortality was perhaps verboten because it is contrary to the natural order and therefore would bring chaos. And that is also true, and that ties into what I was talking about in terms of King Lear. That when you take away the logic and the authority of order, you introduce chaos. And the vampire concept particularly, I haven't even touched on werewolves and lycanthropy, but the whole notion that something could exist outside of life and death. And that's the important thing. It's not that they are well, it is, that's the point. They are undead, but they are not living. They are in that netherworld, that void of existence. That breaks down order. That breaks down the natural order, and by so doing, it introduces chaos into the world. And but that's the topic for an entirely different webinar. I'm going to look through all these comments because there's some really great stuff here. So forgive me if I haven't mentioned you, but I will look them through and maybe refer to some of them next week. So next week, I want to look at fear and horror from a slightly different context. And I'm taking as my motif the dark side, because it is within that dark side that an awful lot of our fears exist, in that we are both victim of and deeply attracted to the dark side within ourselves. So that's all for this week. I've managed to do it almost on time, which makes a change. Do remember that you've only got 1 week in which to listen to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, which I will be talking about next week. So if you really want to know what I'm talking about, tune in this week to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll on the PICT website, and you'll know all about the story and everything that it concerns. And again, I want to thank our sponsor for this program and for the next program, which was done in memory of Corey Dixon, and to say that you too can sponsor a webinar. And if you can't manage to do that, I do appeal to you once more. As always, every dollar counts. If you can send us a few dollars of a donation, it makes a difference, because the more of you can send a few dollars, the easier it is for us to continue operating in these very difficult times for theatre. We want to be here for you. You can help us, and you can do it so easily. Just go onto the PICT website and donate a few dollars, or pounds, or euros, or yen, or whatever currency is in your particular part of the world. Thank you for being with me once more. I look forward to talking to you again next week. In the meantime, wash your hands, wear your mask, and if you're in the United States, vote. Thank you all. See you next week.